The body lay face down in the Arizona dust, 3 arrows in his back, blood pooling black beneath the unforgiving sun. Most men would have ridden past without a second glance. Apache trouble meant keeping your head down and your horse moving. But Thomas Garrett wasn't most men, and what he did next would bind his fate to a people his own kind had told him to fear, to hate, to kill on sight. What happened in the hours that followed would mark him across 3 territories, cost him everything he thought he wanted, and give him something he never knew he needed. The choice he made beside that fallen warrior would echo through both worlds, white and Apache, and neither would ever see him the same way again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trading post at Copper Springs sat alone in a landscape that didn't forgive mistakes. Thomas Garrett had been running it for 8 months, ever since the previous owner took a Comanche lance and left the business to whoever was fool enough to claim it. Thomas was that fool, a man of 32, with a limp from Shiloh, a talent for languages he'd never asked for, and nowhere else to go after the war had chewed him up and spit him back out. The post was a squat adobe building with walls 2 feet thick, small windows positioned for defense rather than light, and a roof that leaked in 3 places when the rare rains came. It sat at a crossroads of sorts. Cavalry patrols heading west, miners heading north, and Apache hunting parties moving through territories their grandfathers had controlled for generations before white men decided the land was theirs to claim. Thomas had learned early that survival meant neutrality. He traded with soldiers, with miners, with Mexican ranchers, and yes, occasionally with Apache who appeared at dawn or dusk when no one else was around. He asked no questions, showed no favoritism, and made it known that his post was neutral ground. Violence started here meant violence ended here, permanently. The soldiers hated it. The miners tolerated it because they needed supplies. The Apache tested it constantly, waiting to see if this white man's word held weight or dissolved like morning frost. On a Tuesday morning in late September, with heat already shimmering off the hardpack and a sky bleached white, Thomas was inventorying flour sacks when he heard the shots. 3 distinct cracks from a Henry rifle, maybe 2 miles east, followed by silence that felt heavier than the gunfire itself. He stood motionless, listening, his hand instinctively moving toward the shotgun he kept behind the counter. More silence, then nothing. Thomas returned to his inventory, marking numbers in a ledger with careful precision. Gunfire in this territory was common as cactus. Getting involved in other people's trouble was a fine way to end up dead. But an hour later, when he rode out to check his small herd of horses grazing in a box canyon 3 miles from the post, he found the body. The Apache warrior lay sprawled in an arroyo, his body twisted from the fall, 3 arrows protruding from his back at angles that suggested he'd been running when they hit. Not bullets, arrows. Killed by his own people's weapons, which meant tribal conflict or something worse. His face was turned away, pressed into dirt already darkening with blood. Thomas dismounted slowly, his Henry rifle ready, scanning the ridgeline and the surrounding terrain. This could be an ambush, could be a test, could be a dozen things that ended with him dead beside the warrior. Nothing moved except heat waves and a hawk circling high overhead. Thomas approached the body carefully, his boots crunching on gravel, every sense alert for danger. When he reached the fallen man, he knelt and gently turned the warrior's face toward him. Young, maybe 25. War paint streaked across his cheeks, in patterns Thomas didn't recognize. His clothing was traditional Apache. Breechcloth, knee-high moccasins, a wide belt decorated with silver conchos that caught the light. His hair was bound with a red cloth, and around his neck hung a medicine bag on a leather cord. 3 arrows, 1 through the left shoulder blade, 2 lower in the back. The positioning told a story, running away from pursuers, struck down from behind. Whoever killed him had been skilled enough to hit a moving target at distance, ruthless enough to shoot a man in the back. Thomas sat back on his heels, studying the scene. The smart thing was to ride away, pretend he'd never found this body, let nature and scavengers handle what came next. Getting involved in Apache business, especially what looked like an execution, was asking for trouble from all sides. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the warrior's youth. Maybe it was the way he'd died running, cut down without a chance to face his killers. Maybe it was simply that Thomas had seen too much death in the war, too many boys left in ditches and fields, while armies marched past them toward the next battle. This warrior deserved better than being left for the buzzards. Thomas retrieved a shovel from his saddlebag. He carried one always, knowing that in this country you might need to bury water containers, supplies, or occasionally people. The ground was hard, rocky, resistant. Digging took over an hour under a sun that seemed intent on cooking him alive. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His back, already damaged from the war wound, sent sharp protests with every shovelful. He dug until the grave was deep enough, 4 feet down, enough to protect the body from scavengers. Then came the harder part, moving the warrior. Thomas did it as carefully as he could, trying to maintain some dignity in death that had been stolen in life. He left the arrows in place, unsure if removing them would violate some protocol he didn't understand. Before lowering the body into the grave, Thomas noticed the medicine bag again. His hand moved toward it, then stopped. Taking it would be theft, desecration, but leaving it meant burying something that might be precious, important, meant to stay with the living rather than the dead. He left it. Better to err on the side of respect. Thomas positioned the warrior facing east. He'd traded enough with Apache to know they buried their dead oriented toward the rising sun. He arranged the body as carefully as he could, hands folded across the chest, head cushioned with his own saddle blanket, since he had nothing else to offer. Then he began filling the grave, the sound of dirt falling on the body, a rhythm that felt both necessary and mournful. When it was done, Thomas stood over the mound of disturbed earth, hat in his hands, unsure what to say or whether saying anything mattered. He wasn't a religious man, the war had burned most of that out of him, but standing there beside a grave in the middle of nowhere, some acknowledgement seemed required. "I don't know your name," he said quietly, his voice strange in the vast silence. "Don't know what you did to deserve being shot in the back, but you're buried proper now, and that's something." He placed stones over the grave, building a cairn that would mark the spot and protect it from animals. It took another 30 minutes, his hands raw and bleeding by the time he finished. The sun was past its zenith when he finally mounted his horse and turned back toward the trading post. Thomas didn't see the 3 Apache warriors watching from the ridge above. Didn't know they'd been there the entire time, silent as stones, witnessing everything he'd done. 2 days passed. Thomas ran his trading post, sold supplies to a cavalry patrol heading toward Fort Bowie, fixed a broken wagon axle for a Mexican freighter, inventoried his stock, and tried not to think too much about the grave in the arroyo. On the 3rd morning, he found them waiting. 4 Apache warriors sat their horses in a semicircle 50 yards from the trading post, motionless in the dawn light. They made no threatening moves, carried no weapons visibly ready, just sat and waited, with the patience of people for whom time moved differently than it did for white men always rushing toward the next thing. Thomas recognized none of them. One was older, maybe 50, his face carved with lines that spoke of hard years and harder decisions. The others were younger, ranging from perhaps 20 to 35. All wore traditional clothing, all carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who knew this land intimately and feared little in it. Thomas walked out slowly, his hands visible and empty, stopping 20 feet from the nearest warrior. Protocol demanded he wait for them to speak first, to state their business. Rushing would be seen as disrespect, possibly aggression. The older warrior dismounted with fluid grace despite his age. He approached Thomas with measured steps, his dark eyes taking in everything. The trading post, the corrals, Thomas himself weighing and judging with an intensity that felt physical. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped. "You buried our warrior." It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. "I did." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Thomas could only partially grasp. Seemed the right thing to do. Leaving him for scavengers didn't sit well. The warrior studied him for a long moment. "You are the trader who deals fairly, who does not cheat, does not water his whiskey, does not short-count ammunition." "I try to be honest in my business. The warrior you buried was my nephew. His name was Running Deer. He was killed by men from a rival band over a dispute about hunting grounds. They left him where he fell, denied him proper burial as insult to our family." Thomas said nothing, sensing that more was coming. "You gave him dignity when his own people would not. You honored him as warrior though you did not know him, though his death was not your concern." The older warrior paused. "This creates obligation. I don't want—" The warrior raised his hand, cutting him off. "Among my people, such an act cannot go unanswered. You have shown respect to our dead. We cannot do less for you living." He turned and spoke rapid Apache to the other warriors. One of them dismounted and approached carrying something wrapped in deer hide. He handed it to the older warrior, who unwrapped it carefully. A rifle. Not just any rifle, but a Winchester repeater, relatively new, probably taken in a raid. Worth more than Thomas made in 3 months at the trading post. "I can't accept that," Thomas said. "I didn't bury him for payment." "This is not payment. Payment implies transaction, commerce. This is gift, acknowledgement of debt that cannot be paid but must be recognized." The warrior held the rifle out. "To refuse would dishonor my nephew's memory and insult our family." Thomas understood the trap. Accepting felt wrong, profiting from a burial given freely. But refusing would create offense where none existed, would transform a gesture of respect into an insult. He took the rifle. "Thank you, I'll use it well." The warrior nodded, something like approval crossing his weathered face. "My name is Greyhawk. I lead a band of 70 people, including women and children. We move between here and the mountains, following game and water. You will see us again. You're welcome at my post. I trade fairly with all who come in peace." "Yes, this we know." Greyhawk mounted his horse with the same fluid grace. "The men who killed my nephew, they may come here, they may seek supplies, information. If they do, you owe us nothing. We do not ask you to take sides in our disputes." Thomas met his eyes. "Appreciated." Greyhawk studied him one more time, then spoke words in Apache that Thomas didn't fully catch. The other warriors responded in unison, a phrase that sounded formal, ritualistic. Then they wheeled their horses and rode north, disappearing into the landscape as if they'd never been there at all. Thomas stood holding the Winchester, aware that something significant had just occurred, but uncertain of all its implications. He'd buried a stranger and somehow created a bond with people his own kind considered enemies, savages, obstacles to civilization's inevitable march westward. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, weighted with meaning beyond its physical substance. He was still standing there when a cavalry patrol appeared from the south, 12 soldiers led by a lieutenant Thomas recognized, a man named Bradshaw who bought supplies regularly and harbored opinions about Indians that left no room for nuance. Bradshaw reined in, his eyes immediately fixing on the Winchester. "That's a new rifle, Garrett. Where'd you get it?" "Raid." "Raid with who?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Customer who wanted flour and ammunition more than a rifle." I didn't ask his life story. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Bradshaw's eyes narrowed, suspicion clear in his expression. "You know harboring hostiles is a hanging offense." "I harbor customers. I sell supplies. What they do after they leave my post isn't my concern, and I don't ask about what they did before they arrived." Bradshaw's jaw tightened. "There's Apache moving through this area. We're tracking a band that hit a ranch 30 miles west. Killed 2 settlers, burned buildings. You see anything, you report it. That clear?" "Crystal." But Bradshaw wasn't done. He dismounted, walked closer, his hand resting on his pistol, not threatening exactly, but not casual either. "You're walking a dangerous line, Garrett. Neutrality sounds noble, but out here it just makes you suspicious to both sides. Eventually you'll have to choose. I chose to run an honest trading post. That's all the choosing I plan to do." Bradshaw stared at him for a long moment, then spat into the dust. "Your funeral." He remounted, gestured to his patrol. They rode off toward the west, leaving Thomas alone with his new rifle and the growing realization that the simple act of burying a stranger had just made his life considerably more complicated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The following weeks brought changes Thomas couldn't have predicted. Greyhawk's band appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk, always quiet, always respectful. They traded deer hides for coffee, turquoise for ammunition, brought news of water sources drying up or cavalry movements they'd observed. The transactions were fair on both sides, conducted with minimal words and maximum efficiency. But more than trade was happening. Thomas began to notice patterns in their visits, teachings embedded in seemingly casual interactions. One morning, a younger warrior named Swiftwater arrived alone, leading a lame horse. He approached Thomas without speaking, simply gestured to the animal's foreleg where swelling indicated injury. Thomas examined it carefully, a stone bruise, painful but not permanent. He mixed a poultice from materials he kept for his own horses, applied it with careful pressure, then wrapped the leg with strips of cloth. Swiftwater watched every movement with intense focus. When Thomas finished, the warrior didn't leave. Instead, he pointed to Thomas's own horses in the corral, then made a gesture Thomas didn't understand. "I don't follow." Swiftwater repeated the gesture more slowly. Then he walked to the corral, studied Thomas's horses, and pointed to one, a sorrel gelding Thomas had bought from a freighter 3 months back. The warrior made the same gesture again, this time clearly indicating the horse's gait was off. Thomas had noticed nothing wrong. He brought the sorrel out, watched it walk. Swiftwater was right. A slight favoring of the right rear leg, barely perceptible unless you knew what to watch for. The warrior knelt, ran his hands down the leg with practiced expertise, found the problem Thomas had missed. A small cut, nearly healed, but still causing discomfort. He looked up at Thomas, his expression saying clearly, "You see, this is how you look." For the next hour, Swiftwater taught Thomas how to read horses the Apache way, not just obvious injuries, but subtle signs of stress, discomfort, illness before it became serious. He used no English beyond a few words, relying instead on demonstration and patient repetition. When he left, his own horse moving better on the treated leg, Thomas stood in the corral surrounded by his animals, with the distinct feeling that he'd just been given something valuable. Not just knowledge, but trust, the sharing of expertise his people had developed over generations. Lieutenant Bradshaw noticed the increased Apache presence. He stopped at the trading post more frequently, his questions more pointed, his suspicion more open. "You're seeing a lot of hostiles lately, Garrett." "I'm seeing customers, same as always." "Customers who raided the Dawson Ranch last week. Killed a family." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "You know for certain it was Greyhawk's band?" "Apache are Apache. They're all guilty of something. That kind of thinking starts wars that don't need starting." Bradshaw leaned across the counter, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "You're protecting them. That makes you complicit in their crimes. I could shut you down, have you arrested for aiding hostiles." "On what evidence? That I sell flour and coffee to people who come here peacefully?" Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "You want to arrest every trader who does business with Indians. You'll have empty shelves from here to Santa Fe." The lieutenant's jaw worked, anger clear in the tightness around his eyes, but Thomas was right, and they both knew it. Trade with native peoples was common, necessary, tacitly approved, as long as it didn't involve weapons or whiskey in quantities that suggested arming for war. Watch yourself, Garrett. Times are changing. Armies getting tired of Apache raids. When we move against them, and we will, you better make sure you're on the right side. After Bradshaw left, Thomas stood alone in the trading post, aware that his neutral ground was shrinking. Both sides were pushing him to choose, and refusing to choose was itself becoming a choice with consequences he couldn't fully see. That night, Thomas found Greyhawk waiting outside the post, sitting his horse in darkness so complete he was nearly invisible. "We need to talk," the older warrior said. They rode together into the desert, far enough from the post that conversation couldn't be overheard. The moon was 3/4 full, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Somewhere distant, a coyote called and was answered by others. Greyhawk stopped near a cluster of rocks that formed natural seats. They dismounted, and the warrior built a small fire, not for warmth, but for the ritual of it, the ancient human practice of talking across flames. "The soldier who questions you, he will cause trouble. I can handle Bradshaw. Can you?" Greyhawk's eyes reflected firelight. "He sees you as obstacle now. Soon he will see you as enemy. This is how it happens. Gradual, then sudden, then permanent." Thomas fed a stick into the fire, watching it catch and burn. "I'm not abandoning my neutrality. It's the only thing keeping this region from exploding into full-scale war. Neutrality is position of strength. You have none. You are one man with trading posts that soldiers could burn tomorrow if they chose." Greyhawk paused. "You need protection. We can provide it, but it comes with price." "What price?" "You must understand our ways, not as trader learning enough words to conduct business, but as person who knows why we fight, what we protect, how we live." The warrior's voice was serious. The burial of running deer showed respect, but respect is beginning, not end. To truly stand between two peoples, you must know both deeply. Thomas studied the older man's face, carved with years of leading people through impossible circumstances. "You're offering to teach me. I am offering to let you live among us for time, learn our language properly, see how we move through this land, understand what your people are destroying with their hunger for gold and cattle and land that must be owned rather than shared. The army finds out I'm living with Apache, they'll hunt me as hostile. Yes, your own people will reject you. Some already do." Greyhawk's expression softened slightly. "But you buried running deer when it gained you nothing, cost you effort, opened you to danger. That act was seen. You have begun walking path between worlds. Either complete journey or step back now, while you still can." Thomas stared into the fire, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down. Everything he'd built at the trading post, his livelihood, his reputation, his carefully maintained neutrality, would be endangered by spending extended time with Greyhawk's band. But the alternative was remaining ignorant, forever separated from truly understanding the people Bradshaw called hostiles, the people who had honored him for honoring their dead. How long? 2 full moons. Live with us, learn from us, then return to your trading post with knowledge that might help you walk the difficult road ahead. And if I say no, Greyhawk shrugged, then you say no. We will still trade with you, still respect the burial you gave running deer, but you will remain outsider looking in, never fully understanding either side of the conflict you claim to stand between. Thomas made his decision in the space between heartbeats. When do we leave? Now, tonight. Your post will sit empty, but it has sat empty before. Anyone who comes will find it closed and return later. They rode north into country Thomas had never seen, following trails only Greyhawk could perceive in darkness. The land rose gradually, desert giving way to rolling hills covered with mesquite and juniper, then higher into mountains where pine trees grew and air turned cool even in September. Near dawn, they reached the camp. 70 people living in wickiups scattered through a canyon where water ran year-round and game trails converged. Women were already awake, preparing morning meals, their movements efficient and practiced. Children played quietly, their games teaching skills they'd need later, stalking, hiding, reading tracks in dirt. Greyhawk led Thomas to the center of camp where a fire burned low. He spoke in Apache, his words formal and carrying. The entire band gathered, faces ranging from curious to suspicious to openly hostile. Thomas stood silent, understanding he was being presented, explained, judged. An old woman, Greyhawk's wife, Thomas learned later, approached and studied him with eyes that seemed to see past flesh into whatever lay beneath. She spoke, her voice cracked with age but strong with authority. Greyhawk translated, "She says you have kind hands. She saw how gently you placed running deer in earth, how carefully you arranged his body. She says hands do not lie about person's heart." The old woman spoke again, longer this time, and several people laughed. Not mockery, but something warmer. "She says you are fool for coming here, that soldiers will hang you if they learn, that you will suffer for this choice. But she also says fools who act from goodness rather than stupidity are rare and should be protected." Greyhawk smiled slightly. "She claims you as nephew. This gives you family protection within band. Anyone who harms you answers to her, and believe me, no one wants that." Thomas felt something unlock in his chest. He'd expected tolerance, at best, hostility at worst. Instead, he was being adopted, claimed, brought inside circles he'd thought forever closed to someone born white. The old woman, her name was Gentle Rain, which seemed ironic given her fierce demeanor, pointed to a wickiup at the camp's edge. She spoke rapid Apache that Greyhawk didn't bother translating, simply gesturing for Thomas to follow. The wickiup was small but well constructed, the framework of poles covered with hides and brush, the interior dim and cool. Gentle Rain pointed to a spot where bedding was laid out, then to Thomas, making clear this was now his space. She left him there with a bowl of something that might have been cornmeal mush and venison, surprisingly good despite his exhaustion and disorientation. Thomas ate slowly, listening to the camp come fully alive around him, voices in a language he barely understood, the sounds of daily life that were simultaneously foreign and universal. Children laughing, women working, men discussing matters in low, serious tones. He'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed, had stepped fully into the space between two worlds, belonging completely to neither, committed to understanding both. Swiftwater appeared at the wickiup entrance, gesturing for Thomas to follow. The real education was about to begin, and Thomas suspected it would be nothing like anything he'd experienced before. He rose, left the safety of the wickiup, and walked into his new temporary life among people his own kind had told him to fear, to hate, to see as less than human. The sun cleared the canyon rim, flooding the camp with golden light, and Thomas Garrett stepped forward into the unknown. The first lesson came before breakfast was finished. Swiftwater led Thomas out of camp to where the land opened into high desert scrub, the morning air still cool but promising heat. The warrior carried nothing but a knife, wore only breechcloth and moccasins, moved with economy that made every step seem effortless. Thomas, by contrast, felt clumsy in his boots and trail clothes, aware of how much noise he made compared to Swiftwater's near-silent passage through brush and over stone. They stopped at a deer trail. Swiftwater knelt, pointed to marks in the dust. Thomas could barely see. The warrior began speaking in Apache, slowly, gesturing to clarify meaning when words failed. Thomas caught perhaps one word in 5, but the demonstration made intent clear, reading sign, understanding what had passed this way and when. For 3 hours, Swiftwater taught him to see what he'd been blind to his entire life. How to distinguish deer tracks from antelope, fresh sign from day-old, male animals from female by the depth of impression and gait pattern. How to read disturbed pebbles, bent grass, scratches on rock that told stories if you knew the language. Thomas's head throbbed with effort. His knees ached from kneeling, but something was happening. His eyes were adjusting, beginning to perceive patterns where before he'd seen only random marks in dirt. They returned to camp near midday. Thomas expected rest. Instead, a teenage boy named Runs Far appeared with 2 horses and clear expectation that Thomas would ride. They spent the afternoon moving through canyons while Runs Far pointed out plants, which were edible, which medicinal, which deadly. The boy spoke no English, forcing Thomas to listen harder, repeat Apache words until pronunciation satisfied his young teacher. By evening, Thomas could barely stand. His legs trembled from riding, his mind swam with information it couldn't yet organize into useful knowledge. He collapsed in the wickiup Gentle Rain had assigned him, certain he'd sleep instantly. Instead, Greyhawk appeared with a wooden bowl of stew and patient expectation. First day is hardest. Body and mind both resist new ways. The older warrior sat cross-legged, his posture relaxed despite the long day. Tomorrow will be harder. Day after, harder still. Then maybe by 4th day your eyes begin truly opening. I'm trying to learn everything at once. Yes, this is problem. Greyhawk smiled slightly. You think like white man, accumulate knowledge fast, move to next thing. We teach different, repeat, practice, let understanding grow natural like plant from seed. You cannot force this. Thomas sipped the stew, rich with flavors he couldn't name. How long did it take you to learn what Swiftwater was showing me today? I began learning at age 4. I am now 53 winters. So 49 years and I still learn new things. Greyhawk's eyes crinkled with amusement. You have 2 moons. This will be interesting. The pattern continued. Each day brought new teachers, new skills, new words that expanded Thomas's understanding of Apache language and culture. Runs Far taught plants and their uses. Swiftwater taught tracking and hunting techniques. A warrior named Stone Path taught him to move silently through brush, to use terrain for concealment, to read weather signs that telegraphed changes hours before they arrived. The women taught him too, though less directly. Gentle Rain showed him how to prepare hides, the patient scraping and stretching that transformed raw material into supple leather. Her daughter, whose name Thomas learned was Morning Star, demonstrated weaving techniques that created baskets so tight they held water. These weren't skills Thomas expected to use, but the lessons taught patience, attention to detail, respect for craftsmanship his own culture often dismissed as primitive. The children were perhaps his best teachers. They had no patience for his stumbling Apache, correcting his pronunciation with brutal honesty, laughing when he mixed up words in ways that changed meanings completely. But they also accepted him fastest, treating his presence as novelty rather than threat. One evening, about 3 weeks into his stay, a boy of maybe 8 challenged Thomas to a game involving throwing small loops of rope over stakes driven into ground. Thomas lost badly, his coordination and judgment laughably poor compared to the child's practiced skill. The boy said something in Apache that made nearby adults laugh. Greyhawk translated, "He says you throw like old woman with bad eyes, but you try hard so he will teach you properly." Thomas spent the next hour being instructed by an 8-year-old who took his teaching role with dead seriousness, demonstrating technique, correcting Thomas's grip, celebrating small improvements with genuine enthusiasm. When Thomas finally managed 3 successful throws in a row, the boy whooped with delight and ran to tell his mother about the white man who could finally throw like human instead of confused bear. But not everything was games and gradual learning. Thomas also witnessed the harsh realities of Apache life under increasing pressure from white expansion. One morning, scouts returned with news that soldiers had burned a camp 40 miles south. 12 Apache killed, mostly women and elders who couldn't run fast enough. The band's reaction was muted, not shocked but wearily familiar with such reports, the steady erosion of their people through violence that was never called murder when soldiers did it. Greyhawk called a council. Thomas sat outside the circle, not yet trusted with such discussions, but close enough to observe. The debate was heated. Some warriors wanted immediate retaliation, raids on nearby ranches or supply wagons. Others argued for moving deeper into mountains, avoiding contact entirely. Greyhawk's voice, when he finally spoke, carried weight that silenced other arguments. Thomas caught enough words to understand the essence. Revenge was satisfying but ultimately counterproductive. Every ranch burned brought more soldiers. Every white killed justified more violence against Apache. The spiral led only down, but neither could they simply run forever. The land was shrinking, water sources being claimed, game depleted by cattle and mining operations. Fighting meant dying. Not fighting also meant dying, just slower. The council ended without resolution because no resolution existed. They were people caught between annihilation and surrender, and neither option was acceptable. That night, Thomas found Greyhawk sitting alone outside camp, staring at stars that filled the sky in numbers city dwellers never saw. "Your people are destroying us." The warrior's voice was flat, stating fact without accusation. "Not you personally, but the great hunger that drives whites westward. We cannot stop it. Fighting only makes us die faster." Thomas sat beside him, uncertain what to say. Denial would be insulting. Agreement felt like accepting blame for things beyond his control. The warrior I buried, running deer. What was he fighting about when he died? Access to spring that feeds valley where deer come in autumn. His band claimed it was theirs by tradition. Another band said tradition had changed when whites pushed them from their own lands eastward. Greyhawk paused. "We fight each other over scraps while your people take everything. This is how conquered people die, turning on themselves when the real enemy is too strong to face. Is there no way to coexist, to share the land?" "Share?" Greyhawk's laugh was bitter. "Your people do not share. They own, control, fence, forbid. To them, land is property. To us, land is life itself, cannot be owned any more than you can own air or own rain. This difference in understanding makes peace impossible." They sat in silence for long minutes, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Thomas thought about his trading post, his carefully maintained neutrality, his belief that fair dealing and mutual respect could bridge the gap between cultures. It all seemed naive now, a child's fantasy about adult problems. "Then why teach me?" Thomas asked finally. "Why share your knowledge? Bring me into your camp. Let me see how you live. If my people are going to destroy yours anyway." Greyhawk turned to look at him directly. "Because when we are gone, and we will be gone, Thomas, make no mistake about this, someone should remember us as we actually were, not as the savage monsters your newspapers describe. You buried running deer with respect when you thought no one was watching. That tells me you can see people as people, not as obstacles or enemies." He stood, his movements stiff after sitting long on cold ground. "Learn everything we teach you. Remember it. And when your people ask why Apache fought so hard, why we wouldn't simply accept reservation life and peaceful surrender, you tell them. Because we were human beings defending our home, nothing more complicated than that." The second month brought different lessons. Having learned basics of tracking, language, and survival skills, Thomas was now expected to contribute. He joined hunting parties, his role initially just to observe and not interfere, but gradually being assigned small tasks: holding horses, preparing kills, carrying meat back to camp. One hunt changed something fundamental. They'd tracked a small herd of mule deer into a box canyon, positioned themselves for ambush. Thomas had been given a bow, not the trade rifles they occasionally used, but traditional Apache weapon requiring different skills entirely. When a young buck separated from the herd, moving through brush 30 yards from Thomas's position, Swiftwater gestured, "Take the shot." Thomas drew the bow, feeling the pull against muscles he'd been developing over weeks of practice. The deer paused, head up, sensing something wrong. Thomas released. The arrow flew true, striking the deer through the chest cavity. The animal ran 20 yards before collapsing, death coming faster than if Thomas had shot poorly and caused prolonged suffering. Swiftwater approached the kill with Thomas. Together they performed the brief acknowledgement of the animal's sacrifice, the Apache practice of thanking prey for giving its life to sustain theirs. Then came the practical work of field dressing, butchering, preparing meat for transport. That night, the band ate well. Thomas's kill had provided enough meat for several families. Greyhawk made a point of publicly acknowledging the successful hunt, and Thomas felt something shift in how others looked at him. Not quite acceptance, but recognition that he was contributing, learning, becoming less of a burden and more of a participant. Gentle Rain gave him a new shirt, traditionally made, to replace his worn white man's clothing. "You look less like soldier now," she said, through Greyhawk's translation. "Soldiers would maybe not recognize you if they saw from distance." Thomas understood the implication. He was beginning to look Apache, move Apache, think in patterns more aligned with their worldview than his own original culture. The transformation was both exhilarating and unsettling, but the outside world hadn't forgotten him. Near the end of his second month with the band, scouts reported cavalry patrol near Thomas's trading post. They'd found it closed, empty, and were asking questions about where the owner had gone. Lieutenant Bradshaw, according to the scouts' report, was describing Thomas as likely killed by hostiles or possibly gone native and consorting with the enemy. Greyhawk called Thomas to his wickiup. "Your time here is ending. Much as I wish you could stay longer, learn more, complete understanding we've begun building, you must return before soldiers do something that cannot be undone." What could they do? The post is just empty. They could burn it, claim you abandoned it, that it was being used to supply hostiles, or they could wait for you to return and arrest you for collaboration. Greyhawk's expression was serious. "You have learned much, but the most important lesson comes now. Walking between two worlds means never fully belonging to either. Your own people will suspect you. Mine will always remember you were born white. This is the price of the path you've chosen." Thomas packed his few belongings that night, aware that leaving meant more than returning to his trading post. It meant stepping back into a world that would see him differently than before, where knowledge he'd gained would be viewed as contamination, where his understanding of Apache perspective would mark him as unreliable, potentially treasonous. Before dawn, the entire band gathered for farewell. It wasn't ceremonial exactly, but there was formality to it. Greyhawk presented him with a beautifully crafted knife, its handle wrapped with intricate beadwork. "This was Running Deer's. His mother wants you to have it. You honored him in death. You have honored all of us by living among us, learning our ways, seeing us as human." The older warrior's voice was thick with emotion. Few white men would do this. Fewer still would do it knowing it might cost them everything. Gentle Rain approached, placed her weathered hand on Thomas's cheek, a gesture of deep affection among her people. She spoke in Apache, words Thomas now understood. "You are my nephew, blood or not. Return to us when you can. There will always be place for you here." As Thomas rode south through pre-dawn darkness, back toward his trading post, and the complications waiting there, he understood that Greyhawk had been right. He was caught between worlds now, transformed by experience that couldn't be undone, carrying knowledge that would shape everything that came next. The burial of one Apache warrior had led him here, to this moment, this transformation, this impossible position of understanding both sides of a conflict that could only end one way. The sun rose behind him, lighting his path forward. But Thomas knew that ahead lay only difficult choices and consequences he couldn't yet fully see. The trading post looked exactly as Thomas had left it 2 months earlier. Weathered adobe walls, corrals empty except for tumbleweeds, the heavy wooden door secured with the iron lock he'd installed his first week there. But something felt different, charged, as if the building itself knew that what was coming would test everything he'd built. Thomas dismounted, led his horse to the water trough, and began the work of reopening. Dust covered every surface inside. Supplies sat untouched on shelves. His ledger lay open to the last page he'd written, before riding north with Greyhawk. The ink faded but still legible. He was sweeping the floor when Lieutenant Bradshaw arrived with 6 soldiers, their approach deliberate and unhurried. Men who knew they held all the power and felt no need to rush. Bradshaw dismounted, his eyes taking in everything. Thomas's sun-darkened skin, the Apache-made shirt barely visible under his vest, the new knife at his belt with its distinctive beadwork that screamed tribal craftsmanship. "Garrett, we'd almost given you up for dead. Just closed up for a while. Needed to check on some opportunities further north." Opportunities. Bradshaw's tone made the word sound like an accusation. That's an interesting way to describe living with hostiles. Thomas kept sweeping, his movements steady despite his hammering heart. "Don't know what you're talking about. Don't you?" The lieutenant stepped closer. "We've had reports. Apache bragging in their camps about the white trader who buried one of their warriors, who came to live among them, who learned their ways. They think it's a great joke, one of us going native. People say a lot of things, doesn't make them true." Bradshaw grabbed the broom, yanked it from Thomas's hands. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Thomas met his eyes, saw the anger there mixed with something else, betrayal, as if Thomas's actions were personal insult to every white man trying to civilize this territory. "You want to tell me where you've really been the last 2 months? I already did." "You're lying. I can see it in how you stand, how you move. You've been with them, learning their devil ways, probably telling them army movements, supply routes where settlers are most vulnerable." Bradshaw's hand moved to his pistol. "That's treason, Garrett. We hang men for less." One of the soldiers, a corporal Thomas recognized as a decent sort, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Lieutenant, we don't actually have proof. Quiet. Bradshaw didn't look away from Thomas. "I don't need proof. I need him to understand that his little game of neutrality is over. You're either with us or against us. And right now, everything about you says against." Thomas felt the weight of the choice pressing down. He could deny everything, stick to his story, hope Bradshaw lacked evidence to do more than threaten, or he could tell the truth and face whatever consequences came from it. He thought about Greyhawk's words. Walking between two worlds means never fully belonging to either. "I was with them," Thomas said quietly. "Greyhawk's band. They invited me to live among them, learn their language, understand their perspective. I accepted." The soldiers stirred, several hands moving toward weapons. Bradshaw's face flushed dark with vindication and rage. "You admit it. You lived with the enemy, broke bread with murderers and savages." "I lived with people, families, children, human beings trying to survive while everything they know gets destroyed." Thomas kept his voice level. "I learned their language, their customs, why they fight so hard for land you call worthless desert. And yes, they taught me skills, tracking, hunting, reading terrain in ways I never knew existed." "Why?" The question came from the corporal, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why would you do that? You're white, educated. Why throw your lot in with them?" "Because I buried one of their warriors when I could have left him for scavengers. Because they honored that gesture with respect instead of suspicion. Because they offered to teach me, and I was smart enough to recognize that understanding both sides of this conflict matters more than blind loyalty to people who share my skin color." Bradshaw pulled his pistol, pointed it at Thomas's chest. That's the kind of talk that gets men shot. Then shoot me. Thomas didn't move, didn't flinch. But it won't change what I learned. Won't erase the fact that the Apache you call savages have honor codes, family structures, spiritual beliefs as complex as anything in our churches. Won't alter the reality that we're taking their land through violence and broken treaties, then calling them hostiles when they fight back. For a long moment, the only sound was wind moving through the eaves and the nervous shifting of horses outside. Bradshaw's finger tightened on the trigger, and Thomas genuinely couldn't predict whether the lieutenant would pull it. The corporal spoke again, his voice careful. "Sir, killing an unarmed civilian in his own trading post might raise questions back at Fort Bowie, questions the colonel would want answered." The reminder of consequences seemed to penetrate Bradshaw's rage. He lowered the pistol slowly, holstered it with deliberate care. "You've got 24 hours to pack up and get out of this territory. I'm declaring this post closed, this land open for settlement. You want to live with Apache so bad, go join them permanent. But you set foot in any white settlement, any fort, anywhere decent people are trying to build civilization, and I'll have you arrested for treason. This is my property. Legal claim filed in Tucson, fees paid, all proper. Was your property. Now it's abandoned by a traitor." Bradshaw smiled without warmth. "Try fighting that in court. See how sympathetic a judge is to a man who admits living with hostiles." He mounted his horse, gestured to his men. They rode off toward the east, leaving Thomas standing in the doorway of his trading post, with the sun climbing toward noon, and his entire life in ruins. Thomas stood motionless for several minutes after they disappeared, his mind working through options that all seemed equally bad. He could fight the seizure legally, but Bradshaw was right that no court would side with someone who'd openly admitted living with Apache. He could simply leave, abandon everything he'd built, start over somewhere else. Or he could return to Greyhawk's band, accept permanent exile from white society. He was still standing there when a Mexican freighter named Carlos Mendoza appeared, his wagon loaded with goods bound for mining camps further north. Carlos had been a regular customer, always fair in his dealings, never asking questions that didn't concern trade. The freighter took in Thomas's expression, the obvious tension still hanging in the air. "Trouble with the soldiers?" "You could say that." Carlos unhitched his team, began watering them at the trough with practiced efficiency. "I saw the patrol heading east. The lieutenant, he looked very satisfied with himself. This is never good sign." Thomas explained what had happened. Not everything, but enough. Carlos listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. "So now you are caught," Carlos said finally. "The army wants you gone. The Apache, they probably wonder if you will be forced to betray what you learned. And you stand in the middle with nowhere safe to be. That about covers it. I have been in this country 30 years, amigo. Watched it change from wilderness to this," he gestured at the landscape, "this battleground where two peoples fight over land neither will share. I have learned that men like you, who try to see both sides, who refuse to hate on command, these men are most dangerous to both armies. That's supposed to make me feel better?" Carlos smiled slightly. "No, but maybe it helps you understand that what you are doing, trying to be fair, trying to understand before judging, this is not weakness, it is hardest path to walk." He pulled a bottle from his wagon, offered it to Thomas. They drank in companionable silence for a few minutes, the whiskey raw but warming. "What will you do?" Carlos asked. "I don't know. Bradshaw gave me 24 hours to leave. Can't go back to Greyhawk's band. That would confirm everything he suspects. Can't stay here if the army's determined to drive me out. Can't go to any settlement without risking arrest. So you need third option." Carlos corked the bottle, his expression thoughtful. "I have contract to deliver supplies to mining camp in the Dragoon Mountains. Very remote, very far from army patrols. The miners, they don't care about politics, only about getting supplies. You could come with me, work as partner for a while. Let this situation calm down. See if maybe Bradshaw moves to different posting. Maybe cooler heads prevail. It wasn't a solution, just a delay, but Thomas had no better options presenting themselves. I appreciate it, but I can't just abandon this place. It's everything I've built. It's adobe and wood, Carlos said gently. What you built is here. There he tapped Thomas's head. And here, his chest. The knowledge, the understanding, the connections you made. Those travel with you. The building is just place that happened to be where building occurred. Thomas looked at the trading post, seeing it differently now. Carlos was right. What mattered wasn't the structure, but what he'd learned here, the relationships he'd formed, the bridge he'd tried to build between opposing worlds. Give me an hour to pack what matters. He moved through the post quickly, taking only essentials, his ledgers, some tools, weapons, supplies that would be useful in the mountains. The rest, furniture, shelving, bulk goods, he left. If Bradshaw wanted to claim the place, let him have the shell. Thomas was taking what actually mattered. As he worked, a teenage Apache boy appeared at the door, one of Greyhawk's younger scouts. He carried no weapons, approached with hands visible, clearly coming in peace. Greyhawk sends message, the boy said, in carefully pronounced English. He knows soldiers came, knows you have trouble. He says to tell you the path between worlds is hardest to walk, but most important to travel. Do not give up because one soldier is fool. Thomas smiled despite everything. Tell Greyhawk I heard his words. Tell him I'm going to the mountains for a while, but I'm not abandoning what I learned. The boy nodded, started to leave, then paused. Greyhawk also says Running Deer's mother prays for you each morning. She says you are her son now, and mother's prayers are strong medicine. The words hit Thomas harder than expected. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis, Bradshaw's threats, the seizure of his post, his uncertain future, that he'd forgotten the connections that transcended property and politics. Tell her I'm honored. Tell her I'll carry her prayers with me. After the boy left, Thomas finished packing with new determination. Bradshaw could take the building. The army could call him traitor. White society could exile him. But they couldn't erase what he'd learned, couldn't break the bonds he'd formed, couldn't undo the transformation that had occurred when he'd chosen to bury an Apache warrior with respect instead of riding past. Carlos helped him load the wagon, his movements efficient and unhurried. The mining camp, its rough place, hard men doing hard work, but they respect competence, pay well for reliable supplies. You could do worse for temporary sanctuary. They left as the sun touched the western horizon, the trading post receding behind them until it was just another structure in the vast emptiness. Thomas looked back once, committing it to memory, not with regret, but with acknowledgement of a chapter ending. The road to the Dragoon Mountains wound through country Thomas knew only from maps. As darkness fell, Carlos pointed out landmarks, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades of traveling these routes. The Apache, they use these canyons for travel, he mentioned casually. Greyhawk's band especially. If I were a man who had friends among them who understood their ways, this would be good territory to know. Thomas understood the implication. Carlos was offering more than temporary work. He was positioning Thomas in territory where both worlds overlapped, where a man caught between cultures might actually find his proper place. They made camp near a spring Carlos knew, the water cold and clean. As they settled around a small fire, the freighter spoke again. You know what your real crime was, amigo? Not living with Apache. Soldiers overlook that sometimes if it brings useful information. Your crime was coming back changed, was seeing them as people. This the army cannot forgive because it makes their job harder. Their job being? Removing obstacles to progress. Easier to kill savages than to negotiate with human beings who have legitimate grievances. Carlos poked the fire, sending sparks upward into darkness. You made yourself useless to them by refusing to hate on command. and useful men who won't hate are more dangerous than enemies who do. Thomas stared into the flames, thinking about running deer, about Greyhawk, about gentle rain calling him nephew, about children who'd taught him their games and scouts who'd shared tracking secrets and warriors who'd treated him with respect he hadn't earned but had been given anyway. "I don't regret it," he said finally. "Even knowing what it's cost, I don't regret learning what I learned." "Good. Regret is poison that kills slowly." Carlos pulled his blanket closer against the cooling air. "Tomorrow we reach the mining camp. New chapter begins. But the story that started with one buried warrior, that story is far from finished." Thomas settled into his own bedroll, looking up at stars that looked the same, whether viewed from a trading post, an Apache camp, or a trail to somewhere unknown. The constellations didn't care about human borders, political divisions, or which side of a conflict you chose. Maybe that was the real lesson, that some things transcended the artificial boundaries people drew, that understanding and respect mattered more than loyalty to groups defined by accident of birth. He'd buried running deer because it was right, not because it was smart or profitable or politically useful. That simple act had set everything else in motion, had led him to this moment, exiled from his own people, not quite belonging to the Apache, caught in the space between with only his conscience as compass. Greyhawk was right. It was the hardest path to walk. But as Thomas drifted toward sleep, listening to the night sounds of the desert and Carlos's gentle snoring, he understood it was also the only path he could live with. The burial had changed him. There was no going back to who he'd been before kneeling in that arroyo, digging that grave, making the choice that honor mattered more than convenience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under the stars that shone for everyone, regardless of tribe or allegiance, Thomas Garrett slept with the peace of a man who'd chosen principle over safety and would live with whatever consequences came from that choice. The story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The mining camp called Silverton perched on a mountainside like a scar, all raw earth and timber frames, and men too focused on pulling silver from rock to care about politics or wars happening in the valleys below. Carlos brought his wagon through the narrow approach road as morning sun painted the surrounding peaks gold and orange, the air thin and sharp at this altitude. Miners emerged from shacks and tents, their faces lighting up at the sight of the supply wagon. Carlos was clearly known here, trusted, and the goods he carried meant the difference between continuing work and abandoning claims for lack of basic necessities. A broad-shouldered man with a beard gone mostly gray approached, his handshake with Carlos familiar and warm. "Mendoza, about time you showed up. We're down to beans and hard bread, and the men are getting restless." "Patrick Sullivan, meet Thomas Garrett. He'll be helping me with deliveries, maybe establishing regular supply route to this camp." Sullivan's eyes assessed Thomas with the practiced evaluation of a man who'd worked with all types and learned to judge quickly. "You know this country?" "Learning it." "He knows things that matter," Carlos interjected smoothly. "Speaks some Apache, understands the terrain, good head for organization. He ran trading posts down near Copper Springs before the army decided they didn't like his neutrality." Sullivan's expression shifted to something like understanding. "Army gives you trouble means you're probably doing something right. They want everyone thinking the same, shooting first, asking questions never." He extended his hand to Thomas. "Welcome to Silverton. We don't care about your politics, your past, or who you've traded with. You deal fair, you'll do fine here." The camp had perhaps 40 men, all working claims in the surrounding canyons. They'd formed a loose cooperative, sharing equipment, pooling resources for supplies, protecting each other from the claim jumpers and outlaws that preyed on isolated miners. Sullivan ran the operation not through force, but through respect earned over years of fair dealing and sound judgment. Carlos spent 2 days at the camp, selling supplies, taking orders for the next trip, introducing Thomas to the key players. The miners were a mix. Former soldiers from both sides of the Civil War, immigrants from Ireland and Germany and China, drifters who'd found in mining a purpose that had eluded them elsewhere. They asked few questions, shared what they had, and judged men by work rather than words. On the third morning, Carlos prepared to leave. "I'll be back in 6 weeks with another load. By then, you should know if this place suits you, if these men are ones you can work with." "What do I do until then?" "Whatever Sullivan needs. He'll pay fair wages, probably ask you to help organize their supply needs, maybe scout routes for bringing in equipment." Carlos gripped Thomas's shoulder. "You're good at seeing what needs doing and doing it. This place needs that skill more than it needs another man swinging a pick." After Carlos departed, Thomas found himself at loose ends for the first time in months. The miners worked their claims from dawn to dusk, the sound of pickaxes on rock a constant percussion echoing through canyons. He helped where he could, moving equipment, shoring up a shaft that showed signs of instability, organizing the communal supplies according to a system that made finding things easier. Sullivan noticed. "You've got a talent for this, making chaos into order. We've been running this camp by instinct and good intentions. Could use someone thinking ahead, planning proper. I'm not a miner. Don't need you to be. Need you to be what you are, someone who understands logistics, supply management, how to keep 40 men fed and equipped so they can focus on pulling silver instead of worrying about basic necessities." The role settled onto Thomas naturally. Within a week, he'd reorganized the supply tent, created an inventory system, identified what they were running low on versus what they had in excess. He mapped the surrounding area, noting water sources, potential dangers, routes that could be used for emergency evacuation if needed. But the real value came from something unexpected. 2 weeks into his stay, Sullivan approached him with unusual tension in his manner. "We've got Apache watching us. 3 days now, same scouts on the ridge above the North Claims. Men are getting nervous, talking about arming up, maybe taking a shot at them before they attack." Thomas's chest tightened. "Have they made any threatening moves?" "No, just watching. But that's what they do before a raid, right? Study the target, wait for the right moment. Or they're trying to understand what you're doing here, whether you're a threat to them." Thomas thought about what Greyhawk had taught him, how Apache assessed situations before acting. "Let me talk to them." "You speak their language?" "Some, enough to maybe find out what they want." Sullivan studied him for a long moment. "The men find out you're going to parley with hostiles. Some won't like it. Better than everyone shooting first and discovering later they killed scouts who were just gathering information." The next morning, Thomas rode north alone, making his approach visible and unthreatening. He stopped well short of the ridge where he'd spotted movement, dismounted, and waited with hands clearly empty of weapons. After 15 minutes, 3 Apache warriors appeared from cover, descending the slope with rifles ready but not aimed. Thomas recognized none of them. Different band than Greyhawks, different territory. The eldest spoke first in Apache, his dialect slightly different from what Thomas had learned but comprehensible. "You are the white man who lived with Greyhawk's people." Word traveled fast, apparently. "I am." "Why do you approach us instead of shooting like other whites would?" "Because shooting creates enemies when there might not need to be any. What do you want with the mining camp?" The warrior gestured to the scarred mountainside, the obvious disruption of the land. "We want to understand what you do here, whether you poison the water, whether you stay or spread like locusts across all the mountains." Thomas chose his words carefully. "The miners dig for silver. They take metal from the rock, send it elsewhere. They don't want land for cattle or farming, just the metal. When the silver is gone, they'll leave." "And the water, the game, the plants we use for medicine?" "The water runs clear below the camp. I've checked. The game, they hunt some, but not enough to deplete the herds. The plants..." Thomas paused. I don't know what plants you use or where they grow, but I could ask them to avoid certain areas if you showed me which ones matter." The warriors exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. The eldest lowered his rifle slightly. "You would do this? Protect our sacred plants from men who dig in the earth?" "I would try. Can't promise the miners will listen, but I can explain why it matters. Ask them to respect those areas." Another long silence, then, "Grey Hawk spoke truth about you. You are strange white man who sees beyond his own people's wants." The warrior pointed to a canyon west of the mining camp. "There, yellow flowers grow in spring. Our women use them for healing. If your miners stay away from that place, we will not trouble their work. I'll talk to them. Ask them to leave that canyon untouched." "Words are empty. We will watch what they do, not what you promise." "Fair enough," Thomas nodded. "Anything else you need to know about the camp? How long will they dig?" "Don't know for certain. The silver vein runs deep. Could be months, could be years. But when it's exhausted, they'll leave. Miners follow metal, not land." The warriors conferred briefly in low voices. Then the eldest spoke again. "We will continue watching. If what you say proves true, if the water stays clean, if the sacred canyon remains untouched, if they leave when metal is gone, then we will not attack. But if any of these things becomes false, we will drive them out." "That's fair." Thomas rode back to camp carrying an agreement that depended entirely on both sides keeping their word. He found Sullivan and explained what had transpired: the Apache concerns, the sacred canyon, the conditional peace that hinged on the miners respecting boundaries they couldn't see. Sullivan called a meeting. The 40 miners gathered in the evening, their faces skeptical and weary. "Garrett here just negotiated with the Apache watching us. They've agreed not to attack if we meet certain conditions." Grumbling rippled through the group. One miner, a former Confederate officer named Clayton, who'd made no secret of his views on Indians, stood abruptly. "We're taking orders from savages now? Letting them dictate where we can and can't work?" "They're asking us to avoid one canyon," Thomas said calmly, "a place where plants grow that their healers use. In exchange, we work in peace instead of getting picked off one by one. Or we arm up proper, set sentries, shoot any Apache that shows his face. Then they'll shoot back. And they know this terrain better than we do, can move through it invisible while we're stumbling around making noise. You want a war, that's how you get one. You want to mine silver and go home with your profits, this is how you do that." A German miner named Klaus spoke up, his English thick with accent. "In the old country, we had similar situations. Farmers and herders sharing land, always potential for conflict. The ones who talked first fought last. Those were ones who prospered." "These aren't farmers," Clayton shot back. "They're killers who've murdered settlers across this territory." "Some have," Thomas acknowledged. "Just like some white men have murdered Apache women and children, burned villages, broken every treaty ever signed. We can trade atrocities all night, or we can recognize that this particular band is offering peace if we show basic respect for one canyon." Sullivan let the debate run its course, then called for a vote. Those in favor of staying clear of the Western Canyon, respecting the Apache terms. 32 hands rose. Clayton and 7 others abstained, but the majority had spoken. "Then it's settled," Sullivan declared. "Western Canyon is off limits. Anyone breaks that agreement endangers the whole camp. Understood?" Grudging nods, even from Clayton, though his expression promised this wasn't over. The agreement held through autumn into winter. The miners worked their claims. The Apache scouts continued watching, but made no hostile moves. And Thomas found himself in the strange position of being informal mediator between two groups that would normally be shooting each other. Twice more he met with the Apache scouts, once to clarify boundaries when a miner accidentally wandered too close to the sacred canyon, once to ask if the band needed food during a harsh cold snap. The warriors accepted dried meat and flour with stiff dignity, acknowledging the gift without gratitude that might suggest weakness. But the relationship was changing. When Thomas rode out to check on something, Apache scouts sometimes appeared to share information. Cavalry patrol moving through the area, outlaws camped in a nearby canyon, weather changes visible in cloud formations Thomas hadn't learned to read yet. Sullivan noticed. "You've built something unusual here. Trust between people who should be enemies. How'd you manage that?" "Buried one of their warriors with respect when I could have left him. Lived among Greyhawk's band when they invited me. Learned their language, their customs, their perspective." Thomas shrugged. "Now I can see things from both sides. Makes finding middle ground easier." "Army knows you're doing this?" "Army thinks I'm a traitor. Lieutenant Bradshaw would love to see me hang." "But you keep doing it anyway." "Because someone needs to. Because wars start from misunderstanding as often as from genuine grievances. Because I buried running deer, and that act created obligations I won't abandon just because they're inconvenient." Winter deepened. The mining slowed as frozen ground resisted picks, and snow blocked higher trails. Most miners stayed in camp, playing cards and telling stories, and waiting for spring when work could resume properly. Thomas used the time to expand his understanding of the region. He mapped extensively, noted Apache seasonal movements, identified areas where conflict was likely versus places where both groups could exist without friction. He was creating something, not quite a treaty, not formal enough for that, but a practical framework for coexistence based on mutual benefit rather than force. One February morning, Greyhawk himself appeared at the camp's edge. Thomas saw him first, felt his heart leap with emotions he couldn't quite name, joy at seeing someone who'd become mentor and friend, anxiety about what this visit might mean. They met away from the camp, giving privacy to their conversation. Greyhawk looked older than Thomas remembered, the winter having carved deeper lines into his weathered face. "I heard you were here. Heard you still walk the path between worlds despite your own people casting you out. Didn't have much choice. Bradshaw made staying at the trading post impossible. There is always choice. You chose to continue honoring Running Deer's memory by honoring the living. This matters more than you know." Greyhawk paused. "I bring news. The band you've been negotiating with, they are led by my cousin, Stone Wolf. He sent word asking if the white trader who speaks Apache could be trusted. I told him you could." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Stone Wolf wants to meet you properly, discuss something larger than one mining camp and one sacred canyon. He thinks maybe you could help prevent war that is coming." Thomas felt the weight of those words. What war? The final one. The Army is planning major campaign for spring. 3 columns, coordinated assault, meant to drive all Apache onto reservations or kill those who refuse. We have perhaps 2 months before it begins. Greyhawk's eyes held ancient sorrow. When it comes, neutrality will be impossible. Every white man will be enemy. Every Apache will be target. The middle ground you stand on will disappear. Then what do I do? Meet with Stone Wolf. Hear his proposal. Then decide if you're willing to risk everything for people who are not your own, for a cause that cannot win, for the slim chance that understanding might delay inevitable just long enough for some to survive what's coming. Thomas looked back at the mining camp, at men who'd accepted him despite his complicated history, then at Greyhawk, who represented connections that transcended politics and race. The choice, as always, was impossible and necessary. When does Stone Wolf want to meet? 3 days, North Canyon, where the ancient paintings mark the walls. Come alone. Greyhawk mounted his horse, then looked down at Thomas one more time. Running Deer's mother still prays for you each morning. She says you have become the son she lost. Whatever you decide, know that some debts transcend blood and some honors matter more than survival. He rode away, leaving Thomas standing between the mining camp and the wilderness, between white civilization and Apache resistance, between the life he'd built and the life that was calling him towards something larger and far more dangerous than anything he'd faced yet. The burial of one warrior had led to this moment. Now Thomas had to decide if that initial act of respect would expand into something that might cost him his life, but might also prevent a war that would destroy the people who'd shown him honor when his own kind had shown only contempt. 3 days to decide. 3 days to prepare for consequences he couldn't fully predict. 3 days until everything changed again. The Canyon of Ancient Paintings was a place Thomas had heard whispered about but never seen, a sacred site where Apache ancestors had marked stone walls with images of hunts, battles, ceremonies that stretched back centuries before white men knew this continent existed. The paintings themselves were faded ochre and white, figures of deer and warriors and symbols whose meanings were lost, even to most Apache. Thomas arrived at dawn on the 3rd day, alone as instructed, his horse left tethered a mile back. He walked the final distance, aware that unseen eyes tracked his every step, that arriving on horseback would signal disrespect for the sacred nature of this place. Stone Wolf waited at the canyon's heart, standing before a rock face covered with handprints, hundreds of them, each representing a warrior who'd come here to seek guidance before battle or vision quest. He was younger than Greyhawk, perhaps 40, with a face that seemed carved from the same stone as the canyon walls, hard and unyielding. 2 other men stood with him, an elderly shaman whose eyes held the distant look of someone who saw beyond the physical world, and a warrior Thomas recognized from the mining camp meetings, the scout who'd first challenged him about the miners' intentions. Stone Wolf spoke without preamble, his Apache formal and weighted with importance. Greyhawk says you are white man who sees with Apache eyes, that you buried running deer with honor, lived among our people, learned our ways, that you walk between 2 worlds with honesty rare among your kind. I try to be fair, to see people as people rather than enemies. Words are wind, I judge by actions. Stone Wolf gestured to the canyon walls. You see these paintings? They tell our history, victories, defeats, the long story of our people in this land. Soon there will be no one left to remember their meaning. Soon all Apache will be dead or broken on reservations, forced to live as whites demand, rather than as our ancestors taught. Thomas said nothing, sensing that interruption would be unwelcome. The army comes in spring with 3 columns. This we know from scouts, from whispers in forts, from the way soldiers prepare. They mean to end Apache resistance permanently, drive us onto reservations in New Mexico, kill any who refuse. Stone Wolf's voice remained level, but fury burned beneath the surface. Greyhawk's band will fight. My band will fight. Others will fight. But fighting without coordination is dying in small pieces. We need something different. What do you need from me? Information. You move among whites, trade with soldiers, hear their talk. We need to know when they march, which routes they take, where they plan to strike first. Stone Wolf paused. Greyhawk says you will not do this, says you will not betray your own people, even for Apache you respect. But I must ask, must hear your refusal from your own mouth. Thomas met his gaze directly. Greyhawk's right, I won't spy for you against the army, won't provide intelligence that gets soldiers killed. Even though those soldiers come to kill us, to destroy our way of life? Even then, because the moment I cross that line, I become what Lieutenant Bradshaw already accuses me of being, a traitor. And once that trust is broken, I'm useless to both sides. The shaman spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly strong despite his age. You speak truth. A bridge that belongs to one side is not bridge, but extension of land. Only bridge that belongs to neither side can connect both. Stone Wolf's expression remained hard. Then what use are you to us? What can you offer except fine words about understanding and respect while our people die? I can try to negotiate, can speak to officers who might listen, present Apache perspective to men who've never heard it except as justification for extermination. Thomas knew how weak this sounded, even as he said it. I can document what happens, ensure some record exists beyond army reports that call massacres victories. We don't need witness to our destruction, we need survival. Then let me propose something different. Thomas felt the idea forming as he spoke, untested and dangerous, but possibly the only option that didn't require betrayal. The Army's campaign depends on finding Apache camps, engaging warriors in direct combat where superior numbers and weapons decide outcomes. What if you make yourselves impossible to find? Scatter into smaller groups, avoid engagement, strike only supply lines and communication, make the territory so costly to patrol that the Army gives up? Stonewolf's eyes narrowed. You suggest we run and hide like rabbits? I suggest you fight smart instead of brave, that you survive this campaign rather than dying gloriously, that you make conquest so expensive and frustrating that the Army negotiates rather than continuing a war that drains resources with no clear victory. The scout who'd watched the mining camp spoke. The white man describes what we already do. We are not fools who stand and fight when outnumbered. I know, but I'm suggesting coordinating it across all bands, sharing information about Army movements, warning each other before they strike, creating unified strategy instead of each group acting alone. Thomas looked at Stonewolf. You said fighting without coordination is dying in small pieces. I'm offering to help coordinate, not by providing intelligence against the Army, but by carrying messages between Apache bands, helping you act together instead of separately. Stonewolf was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal against instincts that told him to trust no white man, no matter how sympathetic. The shaman spoke again. The spotted owl sees in darkness that blinds others. This white man sees paths we cannot because he stands where we cannot stand. Perhaps his eyes are gift rather than threat. Or perhaps he leads us into trap, Stonewolf countered. Gains our trust, learns our movements, delivers information to Army for reward and pardon. Then test him, the shaman said simply. Give him message to carry to Greyhawk's band. Watch whether he delivers it true or whether soldiers appear where Greyhawk camps. Truth reveals itself through action, not words. Stonewolf considered this, then nodded slowly. You will carry message to Greyhawk. Tell him that I propose gathering of all band leaders at the summer meeting grounds 1 month from now. Tell him I seek coordination against coming campaign, unified strategy instead of individual resistance. Tell him, he paused. Tell him that Running Deer's burial has created debt we are still learning how to repay. I'll deliver the message. If you betray this trust, if soldiers appear at the meeting grounds, I will personally hunt you to the ends of the earth and make your death last days. This is not threat, but promise. Understood. Stonewolf produced a small token, a piece of turquoise worked into a distinctive shape. Show this to Greyhawk. He will know message comes truly from me and not from your imagination or Army's manipulation. Thomas took the token, felt its weight in his palm, not the physical weight, but the burden of trust being extended, despite every rational reason for suspicion. He left the canyon with the shaman's words following him. The path between worlds is walked alone, but it connects many. Remember this when the road becomes too hard to continue. Thomas found Sullivan at the mining camp that evening, the superintendent reviewing ore samples from the newest shaft. He looked up when Thomas entered, read something in his expression. You've got trouble written all over you. Need to leave for a while, maybe 2 weeks. There's something I have to do. This about the Apache? It's about trying to prevent a war that's going to get a lot of people killed on both sides. Sullivan set down the ore samples, his full attention now on Thomas. The Army's planning something big, aren't they? I've heard whispers. Supply requisitions, troop movements, officers asking questions about Apache territories. 3-column campaign meant to crush resistance permanently, push everyone onto reservations or kill them trying. And you think you can stop it? No, but I might be able to help Apache survive it, coordinate their defense so it's not just scattered bands getting picked off one by one. Thomas met Sullivan's eyes. I know this puts the camp at risk. If the Army finds out I'm helping coordinate Apache resistance, then we tell them you were temporary employee who left without explanation. We don't know where you went, don't care, no connection to us. Sullivan's expression was serious. But before you do this, you need to understand something. What you're describing, carrying messages between hostile bands, helping them organize against U.S. military, that's not just treasonous. That's hanging offense with no trial, no appeal. You'll be fugitive for rest of your life. I know. Do you? Really? Sullivan leaned forward. You won't be able to go to any town, any settlement, anywhere white law reaches. You'll live in wilderness, always running, always watching for patrols. One mistake, one person recognizing you, and you're dead. Is this worth that price? Thomas thought about running deer, about the simple act of burial that had started everything, about Greyhawk teaching him to see beyond cultural blindness, about gentle rain calling him nephew, about the impossible position of understanding both sides of a conflict where understanding was seen as betrayal. A warrior died because his own people wouldn't bury him properly, left him for scavengers as insult. I gave him dignity he was denied. That act created obligations I can't ignore just because they're dangerous. Obligations to dead man. Obligations to living people who honored me for honoring him, who taught me their ways, accepted me into their families, showed me that everything I'd been told about Apache being savages was a lie designed to make killing them easier. Thomas stood. I can't stop this war, but I can try to help people survive it. That's worth the risk. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, then reached into his desk and pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coin. Your wages plus bonus for the organizational work. You've earned it. Use it for supplies, whatever you need. I can't take. You can and you will, because you'll need resources if you're going to live as fugitive, helping people who can't pay you. Sullivan pressed the pouch into Thomas's hands, and because despite the incredible foolishness of what you're doing, it's also the most honorable thing I've seen anyone attempt in this godforsaken territory. He extended his hand. Thomas shook it, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. One more thing, Sullivan said. If you need sanctuary, if you're running hard with soldiers on your tail, come back here. We'll hide you, claim ignorance, give you whatever help we can. Not because I agree with Apache cause, but because I respect men who stand by their principles, even when it costs them everything. Thomas left the mining camp before dawn, riding north with Stone Wolf's message and the growing realization that his life had irrevocably changed. There was no going back to being simple trader now, no pretending he could maintain neutrality while standing in the middle of a war. He found Greyhawk's band camped in high country where snow still lingered in shaded places. The reception was warm. Gentle rain embraced him fiercely. Swiftwater clapped his shoulder. Children he'd taught games to surrounded him with questions. But Greyhawk's expression was grave when Thomas delivered Stone Wolf's message and the turquoise token. He wants gathering of all bands. This has not happened in many years, not since before the whites came in great numbers. The old warrior turned the turquoise over in his hands. It means Stone Wolf sees the end coming, wants us to face it together rather than separately. Will you go? Yes. And you will come with me, act as voice for those who speak no English, help us understand what the Army plans, if any of that knowledge can be gained without you betraying your own people. I won't spy against the army. I know, but you can. Help us understand the white way of war, the thinking behind strategies, the weaknesses in military organization. This is not betrayal. This is education." Greyhawk smiled slightly. "And you can bear witness. When this is over, when our people are dead or broken, someone should know how we fought, why we resisted, what we were trying to preserve. You can be that witness." Over the next month, Thomas traveled between bands, carrying messages, helping coordinate the gathering. He met leaders he'd only heard of, Victorio, who commanded respect through decades of successful resistance; Nana, ancient and scarred but still fierce; Cochise's son, carrying his father's legacy of both war and attempted peace. Each leader tested him differently, some with direct questions about loyalty, others with challenges to prove his claimed skills, all watching for signs of deception, for hints that he was army plant sent to infiltrate and betray. Thomas answered honestly, demonstrated what he knew, and slowly earned cautious acceptance. Not trust, that would take years if it came at all, but recognition that he was what he claimed. A white man who'd learned to see Apache as people, who honored the obligations created by one act of respect for a fallen warrior. The gathering took place in a remote canyon where 3 territories met, accessible only through narrow approaches easily defended. Over 200 warriors attended, representing every major Apache band in the region. The women and children stayed in hidden camps miles away, insurance against disaster if the meeting was discovered. Thomas stood at the edge of the council circle, neither participant nor mere observer. Greyhawk had positioned him there deliberately, visible to all, available for questions, but not presuming to have voice in decisions that affected Apache survival. The debate ran for 3 days. Stone Wolf argued for coordinated resistance, sharing intelligence about army movements, warning each other of approaching patrols, striking supply lines while avoiding direct combat. Others wanted traditional warfare, meeting soldiers in battle, dying with honor rather than running and hiding. Thomas was called upon twice to explain army tactics, supply requirements, communication methods. He answered carefully, providing information that helped Apache understand their enemy without giving specific intelligence that would facilitate ambushes on soldiers. It was a fine line, and he knew that some in the council saw any help as betrayal of his birth people. But Greyhawk defended him both times, reminding the council that Thomas had refused to spy, that he provided only general knowledge available to anyone who studied military operations. On the 3rd evening, consensus emerged. The bands would coordinate through a system of runners, share information about army movements, scatter when large forces approached, strike only when advantage was clear. They would fight smart instead of brave, survive instead of seeking glorious death. And Thomas would serve as messenger between bands, and when absolutely necessary, as intermediary with white authorities who might negotiate rather than simply exterminate. It was the role he'd been moving toward since burying Running Deer, bridge between worlds, translator of not just language but perspective and understanding. It would make him fugitive to his own people and forever outsider among Apache, but it was the only path his conscience would allow. As the gathering dispersed, warriors returning to their scattered camps, Stone Wolf approached Thomas one final time. "You have proven yourself today. Not as Apache, you will never be that, but as man of honor who keeps his word, even when breaking it would be easier." Running Deer's burial was beginning. This council is continuation. What comes next will test you beyond anything you have faced. I know. I don't think you do, but you will learn. Stone Wolf handed him a new token, eagle feather marked with paint in distinctive pattern. This will identify you to any Apache band as messenger under council protection. It will not save you if soldiers catch you, but it will keep our own warriors from killing you by mistake. Thomas took the feather, understood the weight of what he'd just become. Official intermediary in a war that could only end one way, helping people buy time and survival in face of inevitable conquest. The burial of one warrior had led to this. Now Thomas Garrett would see where this impossible path would take him, knowing that ahead lay only danger, exile, and the slim hope that understanding might prevent some small portion of the tragedy that was coming. He rode south as spring arrived, carrying messages and warnings, living between worlds, belonging to neither, committed to both. The war was coming. Thomas would face it from the middle ground, honoring debts that transcended blood and nation, walking the hardest path because it was the only one that led toward something resembling justice. The Army's spring campaign began exactly as the Apache scouts had predicted. 3 columns converging from different directions, nearly 800 soldiers with orders to pacify the territory by whatever means necessary. Lieutenant Bradshaw commanded one of the columns, his hatred of Apache resistance matched only by his desire to capture the traitor Thomas Garrett, whose activities as messenger between bands had become known through informants and captured warriors. Thomas moved ahead of the columns like smoke, impossible to grasp, warning bands of approaching danger, helping coordinate withdrawals that left soldiers marching through empty canyons and abandoned camps. He slept in caves and under overhangs, never in the same place twice, his appearance growing wild, beard untrimmed, clothing a mix of white and Apache styles, his eyes constantly scanning horizons for dust that might signal patrol or pursuit. In early May, he arrived at a small band's camp just hours before soldiers would have surrounded it. The warning allowed 70 people, mostly women, children, and elders, to scatter into terrain where cavalry couldn't follow. One of the elders, a woman too old to move quickly, pressed dried meat into Thomas's hands with tears streaming down her weathered face. "You are ghost who saves the living," she said in Apache. "May the spirits protect you as you protect us." But not every warning arrived in time. Thomas found a burned camp in late May, the ashes still warm, bodies of 3 warriors who'd stayed behind to cover their family's escape. He buried them with what ceremony he could manage alone, speaking words in Apache he'd learned from Greyhawk, his voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. The war was taking its toll on everyone. Thomas had lost 20 pounds, his body lean and hard from constant travel and irregular meals. His hands shook sometimes from fatigue, and he'd developed a cough that wouldn't clear, but stopping meant people died. That simple equation kept him moving when his body begged for rest. In June, during the hottest part of summer, Thomas finally made a mistake. Exhausted after 3 days without sleep, he took shelter in a box canyon that seemed defensible, intending to rest for just a few hours. He woke to the sound of horses and shouted commands. A cavalry patrol had tracked him there, blocked the only exit. Lieutenant Bradshaw's voice echoed off canyon walls. "Thomas Garrett, you're surrounded. Come out with hands visible or we're coming in shooting." Thomas checked his weapons. 1 pistol with 4 rounds, a rifle with maybe 10 shots. Against 30 soldiers, it wasn't even a fight. But the eagle feather stone wolf had given him rested in his shirt pocket, and he'd promised himself he wouldn't be taken alive to face a noose or firing squad. He stepped out with hands raised, pistol tucked in his belt, rifle slung across his back. Bradshaw rode forward, his face twisted with vindication. "Finally, months of chasing rumors and reports, and here you are, the great Apache sympathizer, reduced to hiding in canyons like the savages you protect. I'm not armed against you, Bradshaw. No need for theatrics." "Oh, there's every need." The lieutenant dismounted, approached with his pistol drawn. "You're under arrest for treason, for providing aid to hostile forces, for actions that have resulted in the deaths of United States soldiers. How many men died because you warned your Apache friends? How much blood is on your hands?" "How much is on yours?" Thomas met his eyes. "How many women and children burned in camps you attacked? How many warriors killed under white flags? How many treaties broken before the ink dried?" Bradshaw's pistol came up, pointing at Thomas's chest. For a moment, Thomas thought he'd miscalculated. that the lieutenant would simply shoot him here rather than bother with trial and formalities. But a voice called out from behind Bradshaw, Captain Morrison, the column commander, a career officer Thomas had met twice at his trading post. "Lieutenant, holster that weapon. We're bringing him in for proper court-martial, not executing him in the field." Bradshaw's jaw clenched, but he lowered the pistol. "Yes, sir." They bound Thomas's hands, confiscated his weapons, put him on a horse with legs tied beneath the animal's belly. The ride back to Fort Bowie took 3 days, Thomas silent despite Bradshaw's attempts to provoke him into confession or justification. The fort was a collection of adobe buildings surrounding a parade ground, walls designed more to impress than defend. They locked Thomas in a root cellar converted to temporary brig, dark, damp, barely large enough to lie down. Food came once a day, water twice, no visitors, no communication with anyone outside. He lost track of time in the darkness. Days blended together, measured only by the rhythm of meals and the slow evolution of his thoughts. He'd known this was possible, had accepted the risk when he'd agreed to carry messages between Apache bands. But facing the reality of capture, of trial that would certainly end in execution, brought a clarity that surprised him. He didn't regret it. Not the burial of running deer, not the time spent learning from Greyhawk's people, not the months of carrying warnings that had saved lives. If given the choice again, he'd make the same decisions, even knowing they led here to darkness and chains and inevitable death. The door opened on what Thomas estimated was the 5th day. 2 guards hauled him out, blinking in sudden sunlight, and marched him to the fort commander's office. Colonel Warren sat behind a desk covered with maps and reports. He was older than Bradshaw, maybe 55, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of war's ugliness to find any romance in it. Morrison stood to the side, and to Thomas's surprise, Carlos Mendoza occupied a chair near the window. "Mr. Garrett," Warren said without preamble, "you're charged with treason, specifically providing aid and intelligence to hostile Apache forces in time of war. The penalty, if convicted, is death by hanging. Do you understand the charges?" "I do." "How do you plead?" Thomas considered carefully. He could deny everything, force them to prove charges that might be difficult to substantiate with hard evidence. Or he could tell the truth and accept consequences. "I carried messages between Apache bands," he said, "helped coordinate their movements so they could avoid your columns, warned them when attacks were coming. I did these things knowingly and without coercion." Bradshaw smiled with satisfaction. Morrison's expression remained neutral. Warren's showed something that might have been respect for honesty. "Why?" the colonel asked. "You're educated, white, could have prospered in any settlement. Why throw your life away for people who aren't even your own?" "Because I buried an Apache warrior with respect when I could have left him for scavengers. Because his people honored that act by teaching me to see them as human beings rather than obstacles. Because once you understand both sides of a conflict, neutrality becomes impossible, and choosing conscience over convenience becomes the only path worth walking." Warren leaned back in his chair. "That's very noble. It's also very stupid. You can't stop what's happening here. Apache resistance will be crushed, if not this year, then next. All you've accomplished is delaying the inevitable and making yourself complicit in actions that have cost American lives. I haven't provided intelligence that got soldiers killed. I warned civilians to scatter, helped them avoid combat. That's different from facilitating ambushes. A distinction without practical difference. You aided the enemy. The law is clear on consequences." Carlos spoke for the first time. "With respect, Colonel, the law also has provisions for civilians acting on conscience during wartime. Mr. Garrett never took up arms against United States forces, never killed or facilitated killing of soldiers. He provided humanitarian assistance to people facing extermination. He provided tactical advantage to hostile forces. He saved lives. Apache lives, yes, but also potentially soldier lives by preventing desperate last stands that would have been bloody for both sides. Carlos pulled papers from his jacket. I've taken the liberty of gathering testimonials from civilians who've interacted with Mr. Garrett, miners who he negotiated peace with Apache for, merchants who he traded fairly with, even some of your own soldiers who bought supplies from his post and found him honest in all dealings. Warren took the papers, scanned them without expression. Character witnesses won't erase treason, Mr. Mendoza. No, but they might contextualize it, show that his actions came from principle rather than malice toward United States. The colonel set the papers aside. I'll consider them, but make no mistake, this will go to court-martial, and conviction is likely. Best outcome Mr. Garrett can hope for is life imprisonment instead of execution. They returned Thomas to the root cellar. Days passed. He heard nothing, saw no one except the guard who brought food. He used the time to compose mental letters he'd never send, to Greyhawk, thanking him for teachings that had transformed his understanding of what it meant to be human, to Gentle Rain, apologizing for failing to complete the journey she'd blessed, to Stone Wolf, hoping the coordination he'd helped establish would save some lives even after his capture ended his ability to carry warnings. 3 weeks after his arrest, they came for him again. But instead of the colonel's office, they took him to the fort gates where Carlos waited with a wagon. You're being released, the freighter said simply. Thomas stared at him, unable to process words that made no sense. Released? That's impossible, Warren said. Warren said many things. Then he received orders from the territorial governor suggesting that executing white civilians for showing mercy to Indians would create political complications the territory doesn't need right now. Carlos helped Thomas into the wagon. There are conditions. You're banned from all military installations, all settlements within 50 miles of any fort. You're to cease all contact with Apache bands effective immediately. Violation means immediate arrest and execution without trial. They rode away from the fort, Thomas still stunned by sudden reversal from condemned prisoner to freed man with impossible restrictions. What really happened? He asked when they were miles from the fort. Carlos smiled slightly. I may have suggested to certain officials that your trial would bring attention to army actions that don't look good when examined closely. Burned villages, massacred families, broken treaties, that having you testify about what you witnessed might raise questions about who the real hostiles are in this conflict. You blackmailed them into releasing me. I provided context that encouraged pragmatic decision-making. Carlos's expression turned serious. But the conditions are real. You contact Apache again, help them in any way, they'll hang you without hesitation. Is that clear? Thomas nodded, but his mind was already working through implications. The ban on contact didn't mean he couldn't continue what he'd started. It just meant being more careful, more subtle, never being caught. They reached the mining camp at Silverton as summer faded toward autumn. Sullivan greeted Thomas with characteristic directness. You look like hell. Get cleaned up, eat something that isn't prison food, sleep in actual bed. Then we'll talk about what comes next. What came next unfolded over the following months. Thomas couldn't carry messages directly anymore, but Carlos could. His freight routes gave him access across the territory, and his neutral reputation meant soldiers didn't question his movements. Information Thomas gathered about army plans got passed to Carlos, who accidentally left supplies in locations where Apache scouts would find them along with notes in Apache language Thomas had taught him to write. It was dangerous, indirect, and less efficient than Thomas's previous role, but it worked. Warnings still reached bands ahead of army columns. Coordination between groups continued, though more slowly. The network Thomas had helped build proved resilient enough to function even with its central node removed. The war ground on through 1873 into 1874. Apache resistance gradually weakened as promised, not from defeat in battle but from exhaustion, starvation, the impossibility of sustaining traditional life under constant military pressure. Bands began surrendering, accepting reservation life as preferable to death or eternal flight. Greyhawk's band was among the last to come in, not surrendering but negotiating terms through Thomas's careful intermediation. The old warrior was nearly 60 now, worn down by decades of fighting that he'd always known couldn't be won. They met one final time in the Canyon of Ancient Paintings, the same place where Stone Wolf had first proposed the council. Greyhawk looked at the faded images on stone walls, the history of his people rendered in ochre and white. "It ends here," he said quietly, "not with battle, not with glory, but with acceptance that we cannot continue. The young ones need peace, even if it's peace of reservation. Better to live diminished than die completely. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. You did what no other white man would, saw us as people, honored our dead, risked everything to help us survive what we couldn't prevent." Greyhawk placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Running Deer's burial created debt we repaid by teaching you our ways. But what you did after, the messages, the warnings, the months of living as fugitive, that created new debt we can never fully repay. You owe me nothing. We owe you memory. When our children ask what happened, why we're on reservations, how we survived the wars, we'll tell them about white man who buried Running Deer with honor, who became bridge between worlds, who proved that understanding between peoples is possible even when circumstances make it impossible." Greyhawk smiled sadly. "It's small legacy, perhaps, but it's true, and truth matters when everything else is lies." They parted as the sun set, Thomas watching Greyhawk ride toward the reservation that would be his people's home for the foreseeable future. The ancient paintings glowed in fading light, silent witnesses to the end of a way of life that would never return. Thomas returned to Silverton, to the mining camp that had become his sanctuary. The silver veins were playing out, and Sullivan was talking about moving operations north to Colorado, where new strikes had been reported. He offered Thomas a partnership, real stake in the business, not just wages. "You've got skills that matter in this country," Sullivan said. "Organization, languages, ability to negotiate with different groups. Those translate anywhere. Come north with us. Help build something new." Thomas considered it. The alternative was staying here, haunted by memories of a conflict he'd failed to prevent, watching the land transform into something the Apache wouldn't recognize. "I'll come," he decided, "but I need to do something first." He rode to the arroyo where he'd buried Running Deer 5 years earlier. The cairn he'd built still stood, weathered but intact. Someone, Apache mourners probably, had added items over the years. Eagle feathers, beadwork, a bow that had seen better days. Thomas knelt beside the grave, his hand resting on one warm stones. "I don't know if you can hear me wherever Apache warriors go after death. Don't know if you'd approve of what I did, the messages, the warnings, the impossible position of trying to serve both sides. But everything started here with the choice to give you dignity when you'd been denied it. That choice changed my life completely, cost me everything I'd built, made me fugitive and outcast." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I'd do it again, every bit of it, because you weren't just a body in the desert. You were a person who deserved respect. And honoring that truth led me to understand your people as people, to see beyond the lies and hatred, to walk the hardest path because it was the only one worth walking." Thomas stood, looked out across the land that was changing in ways neither Apache nor white settlers fully understood yet. In the distance, dust rose from a stage route that hadn't existed when he'd first come here. Fences marked property that Apache had never believed could be owned. The future was arriving, inevitable as sunrise, and it looked nothing like the past. But in this moment, beside this grave, Thomas Garrett felt at peace with the choices he'd made. He'd buried a stranger with honor. That stranger's people had made him one of their own, not by blood, but by action, by respect earned and given, by walking between worlds with integrity intact, even when convenience demanded compromise. Lieutenant Bradshaw had called him traitor. The army had nearly hanged him. His own people had cast him out as unreliable, contaminated by sympathy for the enemy. But Greyhawk's people had called him nephew. Gentle Rain had prayed for him each morning. Stone Wolf had trusted him with coordination that saved lives. Warriors had protected him. Children had taught him their games. Elders had shared wisdom they'd guarded for generations. The price had been exile from his birth culture. The reward had been belonging to something larger than nation or race. The community of people who chose understanding over hatred, mercy over judgment, difficult truth over comfortable lies. Thomas touched the cairn one final time, then mounted his horse and rode north toward whatever came next. Behind him, the grave remained, silent testimony to the moment when one act of respect had changed everything, when burying an Apache warrior with honor had made a white man one of their own and set him on a path he'd walk for the rest of his life. The story that began with death had become a story about life, about choosing conscience over convenience, understanding over ignorance, the hard right over the easy wrong. And as Thomas disappeared into the distance, heading toward new territory and new challenges, the ancient land held both the grave and the memory, preserving the truth of what had happened here when worlds collided, and one man chose to stand in the space between, honoring both, belonging to neither, committed to something larger than either side could claim as their own. The burial was complete. The debt was honored. The story would continue in other forms, other places, but this chapter, the chapter that began with 3 arrows in a warrior's back and a stranger's decision to give dignity to the dead, this chapter had reached its end, and it was good. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.